All right, so before we jump in here, I am going to introduce our distinguished panel. Dennis Wilder, on the far left for you, is a senior fellow with Georgetown University's Initiative for U.S.-China Dialogue on Global Issues. Previously, he served on the George W. Bush administration's National Security Council staff, first as director for China and then as senior director for East Asian Affairs. During the Obama administration, he was the senior editor of the President's Daily Brief and then served as the CIA's Deputy Assistant Director for East Asia and the Pacific. Next, we have Kristen Ganes, the Associate Research Department Director of RAND's Defense and Political Science Department and a senior policy researcher at RAND. She's also a professor at the RAND, she's a professor of policy analysis at the RAND School of Public Policy. Formerly, she served as the director of the Navy Asia-Pacific Advisory Group at the Pentagon, where she advised the Chief of Naval Operations on Chinese security and foreign policy trends in the Indo-Pacific region. And last but not least, we have James Mulvaney, who is Vice President for Intelligence at Pamir Consulting. He's a longtime China watcher who has authored or co-authored several books and book chapters on Chinese intelligence and military-related topics, including Chinese industrial espionage, which is the first full account of the complete range of China's efforts to illicitly acquire foreign technology, which he wrote with CSET's Bill Hannis, who we'll hear from later on today. All right, so Cole and I just set the context a little bit with our talks here. We've been doing a lot of work on China's defense technology ecosystem and development of AI-enabled military systems. And this panel is going to explore China's broader military modernization, as well as how it's using emerging technologies and what it means for the United States and its allies. So to sort of set the context, I'd like to turn to Dennis first. Can you set the stage for us, right? China talks about the PLA becoming a world-class military by 2049. From your perspective, what does military modernization mean to the PLA today? And can you take us through some of the PLA reforms, perhaps, and modernization trends that you've observed over the last several years?
Yeah, Sam, thank you for inviting me. This beautiful building of CSET, I work on the hilltop where we live in the 18th century, so this is rather beautiful. I think we shouldn't sugarcoat it anymore. The PLA's near-term goal is to coerce Taiwan into unification and to fight a major war with the United States if it has to. And of course, we have some reporting that says the goal line for this is 2027. Across the board, you see Chinese military modernization, whether it's 300 new ICBM silos, a surprise to all of us, the huge Chinese Navy, the building of ships at a breakneck speed, the new aircraft carriers, hypersonic weapons, drones. The military parade, of course, displayed a lot of this. Which are real and which are still prototypes is another question. Fifth-generation stealth fighter aircraft, and of course, in the field that CSES looks at, a tremendous capability in cyber. And I will turn to James Mulvaney to answer your questions about China and cyber because he is the world-class expert. As far as the 2049 goal of world-class power, I think it's very vague. I think it's hard to define. I think it really means being a true peer competitor of the United States, which the PLA still considers the gold standard of military power. I think their primary goal is primacy in the Indo-Pacific region, to push us back beyond the second island chain. That's certainly the first goal. Whether their goal is to create a global military force similar to the American force with 11 aircraft carriers and bases all over the world, I think we have a lot to do with whether or not that occurs. I don't think there's any given here. A lot has to do with how the U.S.-China competition advances. Has a lot to do with Chinese economics, stability of the regime. So I think that it's very hard to make any real predictions of what the PLA will look like in 2049.
That's great context there. Could I ask you to drill down a little bit? I thought it was very interesting to hear that what the Chinese military will look like going forward will depend on the United States. Can you take us through what that means a little bit?
Sure. If we are clearly adversarial with the Chinese in the long term, if we remain on the course we're at with the Chinese now, then there will be every incentive on both sides, the classic security dilemma, that we all have to do as much as we can, as fast as we can, to get the advantage on the battlefield. And I don't see how we get out of that very easily, but I am old enough to know that at one point I worked with the Chinese military on funding the Afghan resistance, on setting up American intelligence sites in Western China, advancing their avionics on their aircraft. The world changes, and things don't stay static in the world. There could be a different kind of Chinese leader at some point. We could take a different attitude toward China. So none of this is a given. But at this point, we have to say the trajectory is quite clear.
Great. And turning now to Kristen, I'd like to ask you to tell us how AI fits into this broader modernization drive. Are they seeking to leapfrog, simply catch up with the US, or just even diversify PLA capabilities?
I think that's all of the above. So China does view itself as the underdog when it comes to the US military, and so they do seek asymmetric advantages where they can. So I do think that part of the drive and the focus on AI development in China in general and the PLA is to gain that advantage. And a lot of the ways they talk about that is through information dominance. And so a lot of what they're talking about is looking at, how to use AI to gain advantage in the information space, which to them is often tantamount to gaining advantage in the battlefield. And so the idea is that you gain information dominance as soon as you can, and whoever has the information dominance wins the battle. So that's what they talk about in PLA doctrine. So there's that aspect of it. The second aspect is more a focus within the PLA. So, and I know we'll drill down on this further, but just to pull the thread right now, in 2015, Xi Jinping articulated what he called the 5 incapables related to their officer corps, and it was related to the poor quality of their officer corps, that officers couldn't make good decisions, fast decisions, that they weren't flexible enough, these kinds of very qualitative issues. So the PLA has been focused for the last 10 years on trying to fix these through various ways, and they've done a good job in some areas, but they still, by their own admission, have some of these challenges. And so the other set of arguments for integrating AI into the PLA that comes from the PLA is to help with this decision making and C2 type issues, to improve the quality of their officer corps and enable them to have more flexible operations, dispersed operations, the types of operations that you would need to have in a Taiwan contingency, for example.
Great. And yeah, we'll get to the 5 incapables more later down the road here. Going to James, this is good context from Kristen. Can you tell us a little bit about where we see military-civil fusion playing into Chinese military modernization, right? We did this whole project, and so we have a specific view. I'm wondering, how you see military-civil fusion as part of this. Does it exist as part of military modernization? Is it its own thing? How should we think about civil-military fusion?
Well, it isn't its own thing in the sense that it literally is a fusion of China's state-driven economic strategy with its state-driven military modernization strategy. And it is a mistake to look at the Chinese economy and to believe that there is a private sector part of the economy and a state-driven part of the economy, and therefore, we can sort of carefully parse things that way. If anything, Xi Jinping has done since 2012 is to blur all of those distinctions. In particular, to, in many ways, hobble some of the dynamism that drove Chinese economic modernization since the late 70s by a much greater re-emphasis on state planning, centralized state planning, state capitalist initiative, benefiting SOEs at the expense of private enterprise, kneecapping, Chinese high-tech executives that get too mouthy about regulators. And a natural result of that was for the PLA to take what had previously been described, and actually the ministries themselves described as civil-military integration, Zhonmenjiehe, and instead to transform it into military-civil fusion with really an emphasis on the idea that it's not a one-way transfer like civil-military integration was, but in fact it's a two-way diode where advances in the civilian economy can be utilized by the military and advances in the military can be in the defense industrial base can be utilized on the civilian side. And a lot of that reflects the fact that military modernization in the last couple of decades has largely been driven by dual use technologies, vice specifically military technology. So that makes that two-way transfer even easier. But of course the implication of that is that the totality, as Chairman Molinar said, of the lack of an independent legal system, the lack of intellectual property protection, the heavy thumb on the scale by the industrial planning ministries means that when Western companies are interacting with Chinese counterparts, that it is, in my view, nigh impossible to prevent any technology transfer from then being immediately available for potential military modernization use.
And do you think the PLA is very good right now at identifying and integrating those civilian technologies into the military?
No, I mean, I think in general, and I think Bill Hannes and our other co-author talked about this at length, the Chinese have a very brute force sort of method of trying to integrate in new technologies. And it's highly inefficient, and they spend way more money on it than they should. And a lot of it has to do with sort of the intangible aspects of technology innovation, and what you can't steal those intangibles. You can steal the blueprint, you can steal the source code. In many ways, Jeff Stoff and I were talking about this a couple of months ago. The talent programs, in a sense, were that sort of mortar between the bricks, helping people to understand those intangibles and try and sort of fit those pieces together. But at the end of the day, the reason why cyber espionage, in particular post-COVID, and technology espionage is so rife is, again and again, we see the Chinese side either receiving through transfer or stealing a technology, being very good at reverse engineering it, being able to produce a Dyson vacuum cleaner that is the same Pantone color as a Dyson vacuum cleaner, but not understanding that intangible innovation that went into it, and therefore not being able to make the next generation product organically, but then having to steal the next generation product. So there is still something rotten inside the innovation system, even though they've been able to brute force human space flight and quantum and other things. We see a much more uneven record, frankly, which again sort of reinforces why there's still this very intense focus on planetary scale industrial espionage.
Great. And then last question for you before I turn back to Kristen and then get back to Dennis. Where are we seeing the PLA invest most heavily in AI? Is it decision support systems, autonomous platforms, logistics, cyber, other things?
Well, I want to back up one level, though, Sam, and reinforce something you said from the podium. The Chinese military's embrace of AI is total and fundamental, whereas in the U.S. military, it's largely experimental. And that is because of, at its core, and I'm going to go down a little bit of a rabbit hole here for just a second, that the entire Chinese system and the Leninist system that they inherited and imported from the Soviets was very much based on this cybernetic view of technology, of the melding of man and machine. And I could draw you a straight through line from Marx's Grundrisse and the Fragment on Machines, through Engels' Dialectics of Nature, to Soviet Bogdanov and the techtology movement, to Norbert Wiener and cybernetics, to Chen Shui-sun in China, all the way through to PLA embrace of informatization and intelligization, to the surveillance state, social credit, and the digital RMB. I mean, there is a straight line all the way through there, and it has to do with this view of how society and an economy and a military are really a machine that can be calibrated and measured, and that the humans are the weak link, as you mentioned, the five incapables, and that they view the integrated command platform and other decision-making aids, and the integration of AI across their system as really solving a lot of their human capital problems, particularly in an era of network warfare where we're operating at network speed. And that's, to me, how I reconcile, on the one hand, Chinese military embrace of autonomy, when at the same time understanding that next to my mother, these guys are the world's greatest control freaks, right? And the only way to square that circle is if you have a Laplacian fantasy, as they do, that it is possible to write the perfect algorithm that anticipates every branch and sequel and is also loyal to Xi Jinping thought. Because then you can allow the machine, whereas the Pentagon, our popular culture with Terminator and Matrix and everything else, we have a hopelessly dystopian view of technology, and I'm struck by the Chinese military and the Chinese society's optimism about the adoption of technology, and it really is like in the bones of this, from the Marxist, heritage all the way through Stalinism and the way that they view industrial and technology issues.
Yeah, that's
Well,
awesome.
that felt really good to get that off my chest. Yeah, you can imagine the red string and thumbtack locked room in my house where all of that is.
James is brilliant, but I do get bothered that he always carries Chairman Mao's little red book everywhere he goes.
Yeah.
Great.
Sway.
I should mention that, like the first discussion here, we're using Slido, so feel free to enter your questions. I'll get to those in just a minute. Turning to Kristen, you've done a lot of really interesting work on the nexus of command and control and AI in the PLA. You mentioned the 5 incapables, this idea that, officers in the PLA are potentially not as qualified as the Chinese leadership would want them to be. Can you take us into, how the PLA is looking to use AI for these command and control problems?
Well, I don't know if I could really follow James, but basically what he said in terms of, I think the issue is the control versus the desire for autonomy and more flexibility within the officer corps, combined with the fact that they know they haven't been able to fix some of these issues. And so AI becomes the magic wand by which they wave away some of the C2 issues that they still have. You can see some of that in PLA writings on, for example, centralized control versus mission command. And so mission command is more akin to how the U.S. military does operations, where we do more dispersed operations. And, there's this interesting debate now within the PLA about, we need to do more dispersed operations in mission command, but we don't know if we actually are ready to do that. And there is something that they call the new fog of war, which comes from all of this data that they're now collecting through the various sensors and everything, and it creates this fog of war. And there's a realization, I think, within the PLA that, for example, in a protracted Taiwan contingency, if one should happen, that they aren't entirely sure that they can conduct the types of operations over a long period of time in the fog of war that they would need to. And so a lot of what they talk about with AI is helping with those types of issues, dispelling the fog of war. And so that's a lot of the information data, sense making of the data and sensors and things like that. The other side is what James alluded to, which are the systems type issues with C2, but that's a little bit of a different level. So,
yeah. How successful do you think they will be in using AI tools to get around these human issues? We heard James's take.
I do have a take on it because Chris and I are walking largely down the same road. There's an enormous literature on the Chinese military side talking about the pathologies of their command culture within the PLA, and also how, then they gingerly walk around the pathologies of Chinese political culture, rigid hierarchy, lack of trust, things along those lines that are impeding their adoption and optimization of these new tools. And I'll give you a perfect example, and this is the only I'll go against my natural Irish heritage and try and talk about something optimistic. The contrast with mission command and U.S. military culture is quite striking. So here's the same scenario, but in the two different militaries. One is officers looking at the integrated command platform, and they're they're charged, as Kristen knows, with constantly synchronizing east-west and north-south in terms of using comms, which is why the PLA has such an immensely overbuilt, redundant communication system because of this fear of loss of connectivity. So in their exercises, when they get caught off from higher echelon, they're paralyzed. You know, the metaphor I often use with senior military officers in the U.S. is like, it's sort of like the Borg. You know, when they get disconnected from the Borg collective, they're sort of that generation. And whereas in the U.S. military, when we're cut off from higher echelon, we're like, woohoo! You know, because we're like, we write a memo to higher headquarters, and then we use commander's intent and the acme of military skill and training and everything else. And Admiral Paparo in particular likes this phrase. We just go John Wayne some shit. And, you know, the Chinese can't figure out within the constraints of Chinese military command culture and political culture how to convince the officer corps to go John Wayne some shit. And that's the real dilemma. And that causes them to sub-optimize sort of the way that system is working. And they're trying to, you can't force people to be spontaneous and independent and make mistakes in a system that is so fragile and so fault intolerant. And then you overlay the anti-corruption campaign on top of it as another way of, you know, because everyone in the PLA is so crooked they have to screw their pants on. The anti-corruption decisions are not financial, they're political, right? Because of the pay-for-promotion system. And so any mistake then, you know, it's your apartments, your mistresses, your automobiles, your kid going to Harvard, all this other stuff, right? So I think they're going to have a devil of a time getting out of their own way to really optimize their use of these technologies.
Yeah, and since James mentioned the exercises, I do think one of the first indicators we would see of how they're doing with AI is whether they can integrate it into their very scripted exercises, which are still very scripted, despite many efforts on their part to have them not as scripted. So
they're fault intolerant. They don't have real hot washes. I mean, if you've ever been in a real U.S. military hot wash, you know, you got to leave your ego at the door. Whereas everyone in the room is like, I can't offend him. I have to give him mienza. I have to do this. I have to do that. You know, it's just not the same.
And I would just add one more point on this, which is, I think one of our great advantages is what happened after Goldwater-Nichols, which is the joint operations of American forces. We spent years getting that right, getting to what we call purple today. The Chinese aren't even beginning to get to purple. If you look at the high command, it's still all green suiters, it's still infantry. Joint operations is not even a real concept in the Chinese military yet.
So this is an excellent segue for the question I wanted to ask you. James brought up corruption. I want to talk to you, or want you to tell us a little bit about party-army relations right now, right? There have been these corruption purges or anti-corruption campaigns and then purges of a great number of very high-ranking PLA officers, and wanted to get your take on all of these developments. What do you actually think is going on here?
Well, first of all, I think it's the biggest story in the Chinese military today. I've studied military high command politics in China since I was at Chinese University. And I think what's going on, and this is speculative, I don't have the sources that are telling me exactly what's happening. There is a struggle that has occurred over the last 2 years between the old guard in the military, led by Zhang Youxia, vice chairman of the Military Commission, and the young upstarts led by He Weidong, who was second vice chairman of the Military Commission until he disappeared earlier this year. 3 of the 7 members of the Central Military Commission, which is the highest decision-making body of the PLA, have disappeared. 2 have been convicted and thrown out, and the 3rd, as I say, has simply disappeared from sight. We don't know where he is. I think this is a power struggle. I don't know if it's a policy struggle. I can't figure that out yet. But what we do know is that He Weidong was helicoptered by Xi Jinping into the Central Military Commission. He was never a member of the Military Commission before he became vice chairman. He was not even a member of the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party, a highly unusual thing. And what he comes from and what he represents is the soldiers on the front line opposite Taiwan. He's 31st Group Army. It has a new designation today, but I refuse to use it. It's the 31st Group Army, And one of the other men that has been purged, Miao Hua, was also 31st Group Army. Now, when I say 31st Group Army, they joined at 14 and 16 and rose through the ranks for 40 years in the 31st Group Army. They are steeped in the Taiwan question. And I think He Weidong, after he got in 2022, decided to go after Jiang Wanyan, the princelings, the old PLA. What happened first is there was a purge of the rocket forces, the people who owned the nuclear weapons. Now, we've known for years that those are controlled by cadre kids, by children of the elite. He Weidong, Miao Hua, they are not children of the elite. They came up the hard way. And what they used was corruption. Bloomberg had a report that said that the CIA found out that Chinese missiles had been badly made because of corruption. I believe this was the weapon He Weidong used against the 2nd Artillery, the rocket forces, and that he tried to continue this purge, and we saw attempts at that purge. He went after Li Shanfu, who was defense minister. He's gone. So I think, though, that his disappearance at this point would nominally suggest that Jiang Wanyan has regained control of the situation. But we're still in the middle of this struggle. Tens of Chinese senior military officers have disappeared. The parade was very strange in this regard. The military commander at the parade was the wrong guy. There should have been another. They didn't announce in the military parade who were the leading officers of each of the units coming through. The last parade they did. Now, here's the big question, if anybody can answer it. Where is Xi Jinping in all of this? I have no idea. I think he may be standing back and letting the PLA fight this battle out between them. Again, is this just merely a power struggle between the old and the new? Or does Jiang Youxia, feel that the Young Turks are too aggressive on Taiwan? I don't know. And we still don't have enough evidence. The PLA is great at secretiveness. You don't find sources. You can see in the media, nobody is covering this very well. Everybody keeps calling it a corruption issue. Corruption is the weapon. It is not, as James said, everybody's corrupt. So if corruption is the weapon, then we're going to see the entire PLA taken down. I don't think that's going to happen.
Right. The only thing I'd add to that is that Jiang Youxia was Xi Jinping's childhood friend, and they grew up together in an elite princeling party compound. And so in that way, he does embody the old Red, the Red family faction.
Right.
And you could potentially, therefore, argue that he is, therefore, Xi Jinping's man at the top of the military hierarchy, and that he trusts him because of that childhood affinity.
Except that Xi Jinping helicoptered He Weidong into the position of second vice chairman, and then let him get destroyed.
Yeah.
Maybe he felt he made a bad decision in He Weidong.
I don't know. Love always finds a way, Dennis. You know that.
All right, I'm going to ask one more question.
I'm not
and then
taking love advice from James Mulder.
Happily married 36 years.
I'm going to ask one more question and then turn it over to audience Q&A via Slido, as I mentioned. But this is for the panel. Whoever wants to jump in here. Are there any opportunities that you see for arms control discussions, confidence-building measures, or any kinds of guardrails between the U.S. and China on these AI and emerging technology issues?
I really would point you to Tom Friedman's recent article on this. It's a brilliant article. He worked with Craig Mundy, who wrote the book with Henry Kissinger on AI. I will not do it justice, but basically what they say is it is in both of our national interest that we figure out some guardrails in AI. Because if we don't, we're hurtling down a road where there may be a super weapon, there may be things that we just don't understand. This could be as bad as the nuclear standoffs that we have had. So that is what I will preach these days, that the one area we need to have real discussions with the Chinese on is how do we go forward in AI without killing each other.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to go back to my Irish heritage now. Having spent most of the early part of my career in various Track 1.5s with the Chinese military, and if those of you not familiar, Track 1 is gov-gov, Track 2 is academic to academic, and Track 1.5 is a veneer of academic sponsorship that then allows government officials on both sides to show up at a meeting and engage in non-signaling, issue non-papers, do non-things. And this is what the Chinese prefer for any sensitive topic where they felt asymmetry: cyber, nuclear, space, AI, you name it. And I have just been tracking a real withdrawal, even before COVID, but even now after everything has supposedly been restored, a real withdrawal of the Chinese side from forums in which they used to feel that they had to come and talk, including the really sort of shockingly junior representation they had at Shangri-La this year. And I'm coming away with the sensation that China felt it needed to talk when it was a rising power, but now that it is a great power, it no longer feels the need to talk. And so I wonder whether the period of chit-chat, or as Churchill would say, jaw-jaw instead of war, has really come to an end. And I don't detect anything on their side that says that they're, that, as you would if you're the ascendant power, what is the point now of talking to the power in decline?
And I would just add, I agree with all of that. But China is leaning in, I will say that lightly, to global governance issues related to AI. And so, there is a chance there, I think, to engage, certainly to engage with other countries where China is also engaging on those issues, and to continue the dialogue that way. I will also say, on a more pessimistic note, that we are still struggling with getting China to discuss most things on nuclear issues. Mm-hmm. So this is different than the Soviet Union, for example. So there's sort of an intractableness to that conversation that might flow into other areas, as James suggested.
Yeah, but I'm not a like, in Beijing there's some guy in stroking a white Persian cat in his lap in his floating Volcano Island headquarters guy. But my view of China's push to lead the global AI governance debate is in part a Trojan horse to globalize the Chinese AI tech stack in ways that then reinforce Chinese tech dominance and economic dominance, which is exactly how we used the UN during the Cold War. So, fair is fair.
Great. Shifting now to audience questions. There's an interesting one about China absorbing lessons from the Russia-Ukraine war, and also the degree to which Russia and China seem to be working together on technology issues. Does anyone want to take that, talk about the Russia-China?
Let me talk a couple of lessons.
Yeah.
First of all, I think very important, other than weapon systems, is the Russians were not able to destroy the will to fight of the Ukrainian people. And I think the Chinese lesson from that is you've got to destroy the will of the Taiwan people. I think all of this naval and air activity around Taiwan is to keep reinforcing every day to the people of Taiwan that it's hopeless, that you've got to compromise at some point. And I would predict in the next election, the KMT will win, and the DPP will no longer be able to control the situation, and you're going to see the KMT moving in the Chinese direction. Secondly, there is not one kind of warfare in Ukraine. It is cyber warfare. It's the first cyber war. It's the first drone war. It's the first commercial space war. But it's also World War I redux. So the lessons are very wide to the conflict. Obviously, the fact that you need lots of missiles, lots of artillery shells. The other I would just mention is nuclear signaling. I think the Chinese got a very clear message from what Putin did to Biden, which was basically say, you cross certain lines and I'll use tactical nukes. I think it worked brilliantly for the Russians, and I think the Chinese have studied that very closely, and they're thinking about how they could signal to us that intervention could lead to tactical nuclear warfare.
I will say that we have not done a good job on the proliferation side of recognizing the difference between Chinese shipment of finished military equipment to the Russians,
Right.
which obviously would cross a line,
Yeah.
to Chinese assumption within the Russian defense industrial base of control of artillery factories and shell factories and other things that then technically are not transfers, but are nonetheless sustaining the Russian war effort. It's a fine distinction, but I don't think that the result is different. And it really has been the sort of titanium that has stiffened the spine of the Russian defense industry, which very likely would have collapsed under the strain of sanction and everything else. And I hold China responsible.
I agree.
For
China
sustaining
rebuilt the Russian defense industry.
Yeah.
With semiconductors, with machine tools, sophisticated machine tools, all of this that went very quietly. Chinese are very good at this. I've watched their clandestine arms sales, their clandestine tech transfers to Iran, to Saudi Arabia. They're very good at hiding this stuff. And we have, for whatever reasons, largely ignored it.
Moving to a question, I think, for Kristen. You talked a little bit about China's decision support tools, command and control, targeting. Is there a way we can think about how those tools compare with, things like the U.S. CJAD C2 type of tools? Are we going for similar ideas here, similar systems, or are there differences?
I would say it's probably more of a hybrid. They're not looking to exactly model the U.S. military in some of these areas, especially because, as James mentioned, they're looking at systems of systems warfare, which is systemic rather than individual. And so, some of the AI tools are really related to integration into those types of systems that they would be looking to use in conflict. And so it isn't really a one-to-one. And I would say again, I guess on the similar side, they're looking at integrating AI into things like autonomous weapons, which I think all militaries are looking at that. So it's kind of a mix of the two things.
I mean, even despite all of that, and like Kristen, I spent an enormous amount of time looking at the C5ISRT apparatus and how they're integrating these systems into C2. At the end of the day, victory in the Western Pacific for the PLA is going to be about mass. They have a massive industrial program to build hypersonic glide vehicles. The U.S. military has a science fair project. The Army and the Navy in the U.S. couldn't even afford to have their own separate hypersonic airframes, so they had to pool their money together to make a hypersonic airframe. It's just, Dennis mentioned shipbuilding, which is just completely off the charts in terms of gray hole production. And they're fighting on interior lines because they're fighting 200 miles away from their own shore, whereas we're trying to project and have expeditionary warfare. We're now recognizing that the Western Pacific out to the second island chain is a highly lethal weapons engagement zone. So now we're talking about, a strategy of retrograde or jailbreak where we abandon all of our traditional fixed bases and go out to the second island chain and try and fight our way back in with long-range munitions and with expeditionary operations. And we're pouring lots of concrete at Tinian and Palau and northern Luzon. But all of that is going into an area where the Chinese economically have made strategic investments for over a decade in wharves and depots and docks and airfields and everything else. So they've already established a fixed position in that expeditionary environment, and we're trying to buy our way in on the cheap, frankly, many, many years later. This is one of the sort of, dirty lessons of BRI is it's also really helpful for laying the groundwork for expeditionary military infrastructure.
Yeah, super interesting. An interesting question here about if China's future military capabilities seem to be so much more dependent on AI than the U.S., does conceptualizing the AI competition between the U.S. and China, thinking about that as a race, does that make sense? Or are we looking at different, approaches here?
I don't think it's a race because we're not really embracing it the U.S. isn't embracing it at the same foundational level that the Chinese are. And in fact, I would argue that that pathological sort of ill-fitting between their organizational command culture and these technologies are actually the seams that we should exploit. And so what I've been pushing internally is a focus on sort of counter-algorithmic warfare, where you basically use the judo against their mass, and you say, if these algorithms are designed this way, can we regain advantage despite our lack of mass by attacking the algorithms themselves, by surgically cutting off people from higher echelon, leading to paralysis, which would then screws up the things that they describe as problems themselves within their command culture. And again, it gets back to what Kristen was talking about with the 5 incapables. There is not a culture that says, when the machinery fails me, I am confident enough in my own military education and training to assume a mission command of the situation. I want to be reconnected to the Borg. And all of these technologies, the other metaphor I use with senior military officers, because you have to use, as you know, very simple metaphors, is the nav systems in our car, which have completely infantilized us about situational awareness. I mean, I'm old enough to remember pulling out the Thomas Guide on the kitchen table and figuring out how we were going to get to, Gary, Indiana, or some other hellhole.
My father was born in Gary.
Have you been there recently? No. Yeah. I would recommend a tetanus booster. But now I just do whatever the lilting Irish female voice on Waze tells me to do. And sometimes it tells me to get off at the wrong off-ramp in Baltimore. And then I'm like, oh, this is bad. But again, I've lost situational awareness. I didn't know how I got there. I don't know where I'm going, And in many ways, the Chinese literature on the problems with this complain about that same level of infantilization, that cybernetics drives the PLA leadership to think that the machine has superior cognition to humans. And I think within the U.S. military, you can argue that this is a retrograde effort, but we still believe that the people have superior cognition to the machines, and that the machines should simply be armor like Tony wears in Iron Man. It shouldn't be making the decisions.
I would just add to that, if you want to consider it a race, I think the race is how each country adopts AI within the context of its own system. And so that's really the crux of it, that the AI capability is largely similar across the board, depending on, I guess, how you develop it or whatever. But the adoption of it and the diffusion of it within each military is going to be different because we have different systems.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a good place to leave it. Dennis, I'll give you the last word if you want to add anything.
Oh, no, they're the experts on the AI side.
Well, or just general Chinese military-related things. If not, we can leave it there.
I guess the only final thought I have is the Chinese aren't 10 feet tall, and they're not going to be 10 feet tall anytime soon. But as I think James so eloquently said, they have mass. And when you think about the Korean War, we had every advantage in the Korean War. We had air power, we had nukes, we had MacArthur, we had amphibious landing capability, and we didn't win. Why? Because they could throw an incredible number of people into the battlefield. And that is a big part of our problem in trying to figure out how we defend Taiwan. We just don't have the ships, the aircraft, the weapons stockpiles to fight a long war with the Chinese. And unless we win in 2 weeks, we're not going to win.
No. Yeah, all I would say is a coda to that. Admiral Paparo on the bridge in Honolulu has a countdown clock in his office that is set to January 1st, 2027. I have the same countdown clock in our analyst space at Pamir. And as of today, it was 4:49.
Great. Well, please join me in thanking this great panel.
A real downer.
And we will reconvene in about 20 minutes for the next round of lightning talks. Thanks so much.
Thank you.